When the Republic of France entered World War I on 3rd August 1914 against the German Empire, few could have had any concept of the scale and duration of the war which was to follow. Having already fought the nascent German Empire in 1870-1871 and lost the territory of Alsace-Lorraine in a humiliating defeat, France was determined not to repeat its failures, yet entered World War I unprepared for a new type of warfare dominated by artillery and rapid-fire machine guns. Just as other nations soon found, the men of their respective armies, regardless of personal heroism, were no match for a well-prepared defense or machine gun fire. Machines were to be a key to victory, new armored vehicles carrying guns to meet the enemy, and, to this end, France developed a tank which was to shape their future designs for many years and become an icon of World War I, the Renault FT. Welcome to a New Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. The Republic of France was to suffer appalling casualties in World War I. The Western Front, large swaths of which cut through eastern and northern France, was the scene of some of the bloodiest fighting ever seen in Europe, and was brutal grinding butchery for 4 years, from 1914 until 1918. Despite numerous assaults by the British, French, and Germans on the Western Front, neither side could gain an advantage, and the war descended into a static war of attrition, with troops having to shelter below ground from the murderous effects of artillery and machine gun fire. The industrialization of Europe had created a situation where artillery and machine guns could bring warfare to a standstill, and the military tactics of the belligerents had not adequately kept pace with technology. Just as modern technology and industrialization had created the circumstances for the static war, they also held out the prospect of a solution for it as well. Automobiles and aircraft were in their infancy, but were rapidly turned to war uses, and armored cars had actually been in development in many nations prior to the war. It is no surprise then that, with the slaughter taking place in Europe between the great powers, as armored cars could not traverse the shattered ground, tracked vehicles were considered by Britain, France, and Italy, suffering its own stagnant warfare on its northern front against Austria-Hungary, all around the same time. Tracks to get over the broken ground would then need armor to protect the crew and weapons to bring the fight to the enemy. The concept of what was to become the tank was an inevitability, but these Allied powers had little in the way of coordination in the early days of the war, and each ran their own programs with varying degrees of success. Unlike the British, who by 1915 had abandoned the whole track system, and by the end of the year abandoned other low-slung types of track in favor of an all-round system, the French were still looking at the whole system for their own designs. There was some parallel development in France, with some work on machines such as the Schneider CA1 and Saint-Chamond, but one man stood out with a different view, that of a smaller machine better suited to the conditions on the front lines. The man behind all this was the French father of the tanks, Jean-Baptiste Eugène Estienne. With an aptitude for mathematics and sciences, he had joined the French army in 1883, becoming an artillery officer. By the start of World War I, Estienne was a colonel, commanding the 22nd Artillery Regiment in combat. With a first-hand experience of the power of modern weapons, such as his own artillery, but also witnessing the devastation from machine guns, he rapidly saw the need for some kind of protective shield. By the middle of 1915, at the time when the British were already working on what was to become Little Willie, Colonel Estienne learned of a tracked barbed wire cutter based on the whole chassis and developed by Eugène Blier of the Schneider Company. It was not much of a logical extension for Colonel Estienne to consider this as a suitable vehicle on which to mount some armor. His efforts failed though until December 1915, when he finally convinced Marshal Joseph Jacques César Joffre of the validity of his ideas. Unknown to Colonel Estienne at the time was that Schneider had already been developing its own vehicle with exactly the ideas he had in mind: armor and a gun on the Holt chassis. That tank became the Schneider CA-1, and Colonel Estienne witnessed trials of the vehicle on 9th December 1915. The Schneider design had some very serious shortcomings, not least of which was the mounting of the main gun in a peculiar fashion on the side of the machine, seriously limiting its combat potential. The engineering-oriented mind of Colonel Estienne must have been triggered into action by this experience as, on 21st December 1915, the day the Schneider CA-1 was authorized for production, he reached out to the famous industrialist Louis Renault with his own ideas for a better vehicle, one designed from scratch to do the job rather than just a modified tractor. Monsieur Renault was, at first, reluctant to embark on building a tank, but by the middle of July 1916, he confirmed to Colonel Estienne that he was indeed working on a light tank. The war conditions for France had not improved since 1914, but waiting until the middle of 1916 had now put France well behind Great Britain in terms of tank development. Lagging behind, but not aware of British developments, the French actually tried to convince the British to hold off on using their own tanks for the first time until they were ready with theirs. No doubt, it was a fine idea to have a coordinated approach, but the slaughter underway each day was not abating, and the British were anxious to try and break the stalemate, which was also costing them dearly. Following the British use of tanks in September 1916, the French were under no illusions about the true potential of these new weapons, and, on 30th September 1916, Colonel Estienne, as the most senior French officer with the knowledge, interest, and experience in such matters, was appointed as commander of the newly formed French Armored Corps, known as the Artillerie Spéciale. The idea for a tracked tank had first been brought to Louis Renault's attention by Colonel Estienne back in December 1915, but he had at first been reluctant to postpone or divert production away from other military work for a new and unproven weapon. By the summer of 1916, however, this view had changed, probably as a result of his factory being subcontracted to produce parts for other firms' tank designs, although he had been doing some preliminary work on a tank design nonetheless. Monsieur Renault confirmed to Colonel Estienne in July that year that he was working on a light tank design, although how much of Colonel Estienne's ideas had to that point been observed or used by Monsieur Renault is debatable. What is known, though, is that Colonel Estienne had been unimpressed by the big box tanks and foresaw instead a mass of smaller light tanks, acting like a swarm of bees, overwhelming the enemy with a rapid advance and multiple weapons delivering fire from all quarters during an advance. The conversation on 21st December 1915 between Colonel Estienne and Monsieur Renault showed that what was wanted was a tank of not more than 4 tons in weight, a 2-man crew, a top speed of up to 12 km per hour, and a machine gun in a turret on top. Monsieur Renault agreed to produce a wooden mock-up of such design by October 1916. This new tank would have to be simple mechanically to ease demands of production, which was already at full stretch for the war effort, be constructed by relatively unskilled labor, as most of the skilled workforce was now in uniform fighting, and be cost-effective. The army could not afford enormous and expensive vehicles, which had so far proven to be somewhat unremarkable, like the Schneider CA-1 and the enormous Saint-Chamond. Smaller, cheaper vehicles, and lots of them, were the order of the day. Monsieur Renault was director of the Société des Automobiles Renault, but other key individuals at the firm and connected to it were involved in aspects of the design, such as Monsieur Rodolphe Ernst Metzmayer and Monsieur Charles Edmond Serre. They were to fulfill Estienne's vision of small, fast tanks within their own manufacturing capabilities, and what they developed was to become one of the most famous tank designs of all time, the Renault FT. In order to be mass-produced, this new tank would have to seize upon the enemy quickly and boldly destroy it with machine gun fire. To do this, it was shorter, narrower, and lower than the CA-1 and its huge cousin, the Saint-Chamond. Smaller would mean less space for the crew, and this was reduced to the bare minimum. Just 2 men. One man would drive, and the other would command the tank and operate the weapons. Using a single weapon with all-round fire in a turret was not a new idea by any means, and was already in widespread use on armored cars, and even on Little Willie and some earlier British designs, although the British later switched to side-mounted guns instead. The key advantage of a turret, as used for this little French tank, was that it concentrated firepower in one place, for one man, which allowed the tank to remain small and yet carry useful firepower for the assault. A turret was quite simply the only practical solution to the problem of providing fire to all sides on a light tank. This was realized by the British for their own light tank, the medium Mark A Whippet, which started development in December 1916 and which, in its early form, was the Chaser and had a single turret for firepower. Whereas the turret was abandoned in favor of multiple machine guns all round in a large casemate, the Renault was too small for that to be an option, so it was a turret or nothing. With the driver placed in the front, the commander sat behind him to operate the turret and weapon, and the engine was at the back. The Renault FT is seen by many as being the first modern tank, although such comparisons are superficial at best. The most important part of this Renault tank is often ignored by historians and was, in fact, the separation of the engine from the crew. The British tanks, for example, did not do this vital safety step until the medium Mark B in 1918, and neither the French Schneider CA-1 nor the Saint-Chamond did this either. The bulkhead protected the crew from the stifling heat and fumes of the engine and, perhaps more importantly, from potential engine fires. Monsieur Renault finished his wooden mock-up on schedule in October 1916 and showed it to Colonel Estienne. This design set the basic layout for the vehicle over its life, although each part was subject to changes at one point or another. For this wooden mock-up, the turret was nothing more than a simple cylinder with the only armament. Stood inside the tank, with his head and shoulders inside the turret, was the commander, who could use a hatch in the turret to climb in and out. The driver, however, sat at the front, and would have to use a hatch on the front deck of the tank, a very dangerous prospect for him if he had to get out facing enemy fire. Perhaps the biggest hurdle to the development of the FT were not the relative merits or deficiencies of the design, but the French military mindset. For a big battle, it was logical that a big assault, a big gun, or a big weapon were the solution, and the concept of a small light tank was perhaps incongruous in the face of large British tanks and the no less huge Saint-Chamond. Brigadier General Léon Augustin Muret, Director General of Motor Services, though, was reluctant to adopt the Renault design, which, at the time, was being developed under the working title of char mitrailleur. He was likely conscious of interfering with the production of other equipment, such as trucks, tractors, and artillery. A new mock-up char mitrailleur was presented on 30th December 1916 to the Consultative Committee of the Assault Artillery. General Muret remained unimpressed, however, despite no longer being the minister in charge, complaining the vehicle was too light, with the center of gravity too far back, making it unstable, and that there was inadequate ventilation for the crew. Other suggestions included a wider hull and turret, and storage for up to 10,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition. Normal carriage was just 1,820 rounds. The basic design from October 1916 had been set, but there were still deficiencies in the design. The cylindrical turret for the commander, gunner, who had to do both jobs simultaneously, was only fitted with crude vision slits, making for very limited observation of the ground around the tank. The body of the tank was a large riveted box with a bulbous back end housing the engine. At the back of this body was a small starting handle for the engine, and there was a small air intake at the top. The suspension changed little from the prototype to production, although the vertical spring in the center of the suspension, which connected to the arm holding the return rollers, was removed for production as it had little value. The arrangements of the body and turret were not ideal, and wasted space and weight, both of which were critical. By December 1916, significant modifications to both had been made. The hull's back was cut much shorter, saving a lot of weight, and the small cylindrical turret was replaced with a much wider hexagonal one, with a cross-shaped vision slit in each face. The turret also overhung the side of the hull, necessitating small flanges to be attached to the hull to cover the bottom of the turret where it projected. All of the plates used in this revised design were flat and to be made by riveting to a small frame. All of the plates used in this revised design were flat and to be made by riveting to a steel frame inside the vehicle. Some of the suggestions from the December 1916 examination were acceptable to the design team, but others were clearly impractical. The consultative committee of the assault artillery then voted on production. The vote was 7-3 in favor of production, and orders for 100 chars mitrailleurs followed. That order was increased in February 1917 to 150 vehicles, although Colonel Estienne had been pressing for orders for 1,000. It is important to note that the name FT was never an abbreviation or acronym, despite numerous books and websites claiming explanations for the initials including faible tonnage, low tonnage, or franchisseur de tranchées, trench crosser. The name FT was none of these. It was just a factory code for this char mitrailleur, nothing more, nothing less. All the Renault tank products were issued with a 2-letter code, serving to identify and differentiate them. The FT simply followed FS, and would in turn be followed by an FU, which was later used for a heavy Renault lorry, then FV. The Renault FT is also often referred to as the FT-17, although this specific naming was never acknowledged by Renault or any official working on the project. The 17, of course, was in connection to the year 1917, as it was customary for many French weapons of the time, creating the Char Léger Renault FT Model 1917. The FT-17 designation, though, was only later referred to, after the war. For the duration of World War I, it was simply the Renault FT for convenience. A single prototype vehicle for this new version of the FT was delivered in January 1917, and performed first trials at Renault's factory at Boulogne-Billancourt, before being sent to Colonel Estienne to the Artillerie Spéciale, proving grounds at Champleau, northeast of Paris, for final corrections before its official make-or-break trials in April that year. If getting an order for a prototype and small production for this light tank idea was a win, then in April 1917, even before the trials, Colonel Estienne was triumphant. The consultative committee of the assault artillery was on his side and voted in favor of his plans for production of 1,000 example. This triumph was further crowned by General Nivelle, who, whilst not an opponent of tank production, was now a convert to armored warfare and supported this production. Official trials took place at Marly, southeast of Lille, between 21st and 22nd April 1917. Here, during comparative trials against the Schneider CA-1 and Saint-Chamond tanks, the diminutive FT was shown to be superior. Perhaps buoyed by his success in winning over General Nivelle and the proof of concept beating any other tank the French had, Colonel Estienne then suggested that this machine-gun-armed tank be fitted with a small 37mm gun, creating a char canon. It had never been intended to carry anything other than a machine gun until this point, but he felt that a version of the 37mm Model 16 TR infantry cannon could be made to fit and would provide some useful support to infantry in attacking enemy defenses. A machine gun, after all, was almost useless against an enemy bunker, but a small gun could fire high explosive shells right where they were needed, instead of relying on field artillery behind the assault. There was insufficient space for both a cannon and a machine gun, but, as these vehicles were to be used in groups, they would be able to provide complementary fire for each other, with the char canon taking out the strong points and the char mitrailleur taking out the infantry. General Nivelle might have been converted to the value of the tank, but Monsieur Albert Thomas was not to be convinced. The small space inside the turret effectively limited it to a commander not more than 1.68 meters tall. This, combined with concerns over the instability of the vehicle, the ventilation for the crew, inadequate ammunition capacity, and the difficulty of one man commanding and operating the gun, led to him suggesting an additional crew member be added to operate the main armament. The addition of a third crew member would mean a total redesign of the vehicle to accommodate him, but would, in fairness, have solved a problem that was to plague French tanks for a generation: the tiny one-man turret. Regardless of his concerns, right or wrong, it was too late. General Nivelle's offensive on Chemin des Dames was an utter failure, with great loss of life. Further delays to a tank program were no longer acceptable. Monsieur Thomas, though, left on an overseas trip and, in his absence, Colonel Estienne simply worked around him. He demonstrated the tank for officers from the disastrous Chemin des Dames offensive, including those who had fought with the Schneider and Saint-Chamond tanks, in what was France's first use of tanks. They were convinced. Their insistence and the political pressure of a failure to break the stalemate on the Western Front now persuaded even the reluctant General Muret that they were needed urgently, and he overruled Monsieur Thomas's order. The original order for 1,000 vehicles was replaced with a new order for 1,150 vehicles, consisting of 500 of the original char mitrailleur armed with the 8mm Hotchkiss machine gun, and 650 of the new char canon fitted with the 37mm gun. Marshal Pétain, himself an artillery officer, knew Colonel Estienne, and had, in general terms, agreed on the need for tanks and that small, fast tanks could overwhelm an enemy, unlike the large and slow Schneider CA-1 and Saint-Chamond. In a brutal war of attrition, production played a part too, and the tiny FT had a small manufacturing footprint. 5 FTs could be built for every heavy tank, and those heavy tanks were not armored sufficiently to stop German artillery fire. Instead of armor then, these small tanks would rely on their small size and good mobility to avoid enemy fire. Pétain did not need much additional convincing after Chemin des Dames, and increased the order from 1,150 vehicles to 3,500 instead. The design undoubtedly had significant flaws, but it had a single massive advantage over every other design available. It worked. Rather than wait on new and improved designs, Pétain made use of what he had, a working design, and one intended for a new offensive in spring 1918. To smooth out production, the hurdle that was Monsieur Albert Thomas was removed too, replaced in September 1917 by the Under-Secretary of State for Artillery and Munitions, industrialist Monsieur Louis Loucheur. Nothing was going to get in the way of Pétain's new tank, so when, shortly after placing this order, it was found that Renault would not be able to produce all these vehicles itself in time, Renault waived any patent right issues, allowing production to go to other factories. Contracts were eventually issued to Berliet, Saumuur, and Delaunay-Belleville, as well as consideration of production outside France, in Italy and the United States, in order to produce the numbers demanded. The development phase of the Renault FT, one of the most identifiable and famous tanks of all time, had concluded. The vehicle would undergo significant modifications and trials with various nations, and see action beyond World War I in many theaters. It was not a perfect tank by any means. The tiny one-man turret, the front axis for the driver, the lack of a radio, and the relatively weak armament would plague the vehicle and its many variants. But the design was to prove the most successful French tank of World War I, even if it nearly never happened at all. This was all for this video. Make sure to follow and subscribe, and also check out our website. We'll be releasing new articles on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Reddit. If you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. And if you would like to help us continue to develop and expand, consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to help us improve and design new articles and features for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.